Good afternoon, Freddy, and welcome to Design Dialogues hosted by Fublis. This is your host, Bhavya, and today we have the pleasure of speaking with Freddy, the creative director of Lapis Bureau. Just to give a brief introduction about your studio, Lapis Bureau is a multidisciplinary architecture and design firm committed to creating thoughtful, context driven spaces that seamlessly blend aesthetics, functionality, and sustainability. With a strong emphasis on aesthetics, functionality, and sustainability, material exploration, and craftsmanship, the firm takes a research oriented approach to design, ensuring each project responds to its culture and environmental solutions. To their portfolio spans from architecture, interiors, and product designing, their philosophy guides from innovation and precision. Thank you so much for joining us today, Freddy.
My pleasure. Good afternoon.
Yeah. So before starting the questions, I would like to inform you that this interview will be published on the website of Fublis. So sign up to the Fublis website and you'll get the access to watch this interview. So shall we proceed with the questions?
No problem. Yes, we can start.
So first question for the day. Lapis Bureau philosophy prioritizes how it should work over what it should look like. How do you balance functionality with aesthetics, especially when working on international projects with diverse cultural contexts?
All right. Well, for us, functionality is somehow the foundation of every project, I would say. We would always start by trying to understand how the space should work, eventually how people would interact with the space or move through it or experience it in different cases, of course, according to the function of the project during their daily lives. So the aesthetics eventually is naturally emerging from this process rather than being imposed on it as a separate layer, as an extra addition to the project. So we believe that in that sense, beauty would come from the clarity and efficiency on this purpose-driven design. When we are working on international projects, the cultural context also plays a huge role because every place has its own way of using space in different ways and maybe its own language and its own expectations of functionalities. Ultimately, our goal is to try to create spaces that just don't look good in photos, but actually work well for the people that are using them. So whether it's a restaurant or a public installation or an office that we work on, we try to balance the function and the aesthetics in a way that is not just a compromise, but somehow that they are well integrated for their final delivery.
So, Fred, talking about the project, the blue container serves as one of the focal point of the design, refining separations and interconnections in the Atlas workshop and office in Shenzhen. How did you arrive at this choice, and what role do you see making such bold elements playing in the spatial narrative of any project?
Yeah, let me first a bit introduce the project. In this case, the Atlas offices was a space that was not just an office, but also needed to be a physical workshop. They are testing their tools and their design products in different ways. So they needed not only the operational part of the office, but the practical part of the workshop. Literally, they would testing how some barbecues are burning over time. So there would be smoke, there would be fire hazards, there would be the need of cleansing the space with a lot of water. So we had somehow to manage this large industrial loft space in a way that we could integrate all the different functions and needs of this group, of this brand. At the same time, without compromising the fact that this large open space was very beautiful and that's something that we wanted to preserve. At the end, this blue container inside the office, inside the space, is not just a bold visual statement for the pure of the aesthetics, but somehow for us became a strategic tool to define the space in here. We wanted to keep the space as a dynamic workspace, somehow balancing this openness with the zoning that I talked about. So instead of relying on the traditional partition walls, we used this container as a multifunctional architectural element in the middle of the space that is a sculptural presence, but at the same time it defines the different areas, creating fluidity and interaction between these areas. So the choice of this container, of course, on one side as a modular, flexible, and somehow element that provide this industrial pragmatism that we wanted to embed in the space, is fitting very well into this creative and collaborative space. At the same time, it becomes the center of the space, we were enabled to create kind of an extended second floor, lofted floor, thanks to the usage of the top of the container. And the container itself has been adapted so it could be totally open up to walk through and see through, as well as closed by glass partition, becoming a soundproof meeting room at the center of the space that actually they are using also as a, let's say, canteen lounge during the day. So it acts as a separator, but at the same time, these openings and the positioning it has create these unexpected functions and these unexpected usages for it. And at the same time, of course, it's quite visually and physically pleasant. Such bold elements and these little details, I believe, always play a very interesting role in the narrative of this space. And in here, it became also, let's say, the main iconic element of this.
So this project also balances industrial and warm materials across distinct functional areas. So what challenges did you face in achieving this harmony, and how did you ensure that it completes and complements the workflow of the project?
So, as I mentioned before, this was an old industrial space that somehow had an interesting character that we wanted to preserve. At the same time, we wanted to make it functional and inviting, let's say a place where their creative side and their productive side could be merged together in a very nice way. So one of the biggest challenges probably was to ensure that such industrial elements like the blue container or the exposed steel structures that we used or the raw concrete floor that we kept didn't make the space feel maybe too cold or rigid. So on the other hand, the warm materials that we introduced, such the wood pellets or the soft textiles in some areas, or all the different kind of lighting that we use, have been introduced somehow to soften the general feeling of this space without losing the raw feeling, especially in the part of the workshop that we really wanted to preserve. In order to achieve this, we somehow try to zone the materials according to their function. So the industrial elements would define more the workspace on the lower floor, where there is a stronger sense of industrial feeling. And the warmer materials and tones and colors are concentrated in the upper floor and in the entry area, where the spaces are more, let's say, collaborative or relaxed according to the time of the day. So somehow this workflow integration, it also translated into how we apply the different materials and colors in the different areas. So as I said, the warmer tones more into the social spaces, gathering spaces, and the colder and more raw materials in the practical areas of the workshop. So this project somehow proved that these contrasts don't have to necessarily compete when you can compose them in a certain way, but they actually make each other stronger. So the space at the end is very functional, but also deeply engaging visually. And it's a beautiful place to take photos as well of their products and their stuff. So we were happy and they were very happy. It worked very well.
So the lighting solution in the workshop is described as one of the dream environment for the engineers. Could you elaborate on the process of integrating this feature and its impact on the productivity of the project?
Yeah, so the lighting was very crucial in this project because, as I mentioned, there's somehow a engineering department on the lower floor of the workshop that needs somehow very focused and precision lighting. So the idea of, let's say, dream environment comes from the fact that we not only provide a very nice diffuse lighting using the existing beam structures to create this fully lit ceiling that makes a diffuse light that doesn't create any cast shadow. So in the different, let's say, wings, there is on one side an electrical department, a tooling department area, and in the center there is a space that can be configured in different ways thanks to working tables. This would create an optimal situation with this very, very strong light. At the same time, of course, we had to create also softer and more, how do you say, let's say, sexy lighting, warmer lighting for the areas where they would gather, or where they would have a conversation, or where they would work. So we combine the cold and warm tones of the light in different ways according to how it could be used during the day in the different areas. Somehow this lighting is not having a functional and special role, but we tried also to have an impact on the psychology of the workers, of the team that is there. So creating somehow this multi-layer lighting strategy, hopefully we enhance their productivity, but we also created an environment where their engineers and designers can feel inspired, comfortable, and do what they need to do at their best.
So, Freddie, as someone with very extensive international experience, how has working across various culture and geographical landscapes shaped your perspective on architecture and its role in the society?
Well, that's a tough, broad question, but I think that having worked in different part of the globe, somehow I believe that design, good design, whether it's in interior architecture or landscape, as I said before, is really not just about the aesthetics. Of course, this is important, but somehow it comes afterwards. It's more about like the context that you create and how people and the purpose of the space is defined in our process as designers. Every place will have its own history, traditions, climate, for instance, or way of life of the local people. So all these different factors must inform our design process to create a space that is somehow meaningful at the end and functional. If there would be the perfect recipe for the perfect school or the perfect office, they would always look the same, right? So there's always things that would make it more perfect or more meaningful, that this comes from our design process and understanding of the project. Eventually, I've learned over the years the importance of listening and observing, not only, let's say, the client demands, to put it simple, but also how the different parties are involved in the project, in the space, in doing what they need to do. So in each project, whether it's in Europe or in China, I always try to take time to maybe understand the local materials and construction techniques, what we can find around the area. Then, the differences are really based, they cannot be generalized on a bigger level. But I could say that, for example, in China, there's always a more strong emphasis on flexibility and adaptability in spaces in general. This we can see that is reflecting historically on their courtyard typology, and at the same time, the fast-paced, evolving urban landscape that in any major city in China would occur. While in Europe, especially in Italy, every project would rather require a deeper thinking or dialogue about heritage or craftsmanship, ensuring that any new thing you do is respecting the other historical fabric or some archaeology pieces that you might find. So this global perspective has somehow maybe taught me that the interior design and the architecture plays physically a vital role in how the social interactions will occur. And this is really based on the local community. So that's why I said also in the beginning, is much more important for me to really understand how something would work and then rather make it beautiful. Because when you are nailing that part, with the client, with the customers and so on, it's always going to work. It doesn't matter how you're going to make it look, but it doesn't work vice versa. So I believe it's very important that in our research and design process, we focus really on the function first and to deliver the best that we.
So, Freddie, with reference to the Bosch headquarter offices in Shenzhen, the fracture fluency pattern is noted for its very good stress reducing effects. Could you elaborate on how this design choice was tested or validated in the workplace and its overall impact on the employee well-being of that project?
All right. So let's start from what is fractal fluency, just in case is somehow a repetitive, natural pattern. This is something that you would see in how the branches of a tree would expand, or how the structure of the leaves are generated, or how clouds geometry are created, and so on. So this self-repeating form somehow have shown to have a measurable stress reduction effect, because our eyes are somehow in the subconsciously understanding that rhythm and that pattern as something that we see on a daily basis when we walk on the street, when we see in the natures, and so on. So recreating these new offices that before the renovation, they were very, let me say, old school, narrow spaces, corridors without lighting. They were inside different rooms, some of them without windows. Suddenly we were giving them a totally brand new environment, total open space. And by creating this open space, we also needed to understand how to define the space without creating walls. The way we achieve this is not only by using different colors and somehow patterns on the floor, but also on a different scale, applying the same logic into the ceiling, into the structure of the ceiling. Sometimes we have false ceiling, sometimes we have these elements that again are repeating this fractal fluency on a larger scale on the ceiling, and they act as light diffusers, or they act as acoustic panels. So this, let's say, pattern is something that has been applied on a medium scale on the texture and pattern of the different gray tones of the floor. On a larger scale has been applied in the ceiling, in how we created these larger shapes for functional purposes that become also very visually impacting, and also on a micro level of, again, micro patterns in some stickers on the glasses, or a smaller detail in the, the partitions between the desks. So this, I believe, in the subconscious of the employees will somehow relax their psychology at work. They relax the visual stress that they might have. So it would be difficult to physically prove it with data, as long as we were not using some ECG brain reading devices, which would be possible. But definitely it has been a successful result. They were very happy eventually of their result, and they are very comfortable with their offices. And in a matter of fact, we kept on following the project. We expanded also on different floors and in the rooftop this logic. So somehow I believe that if we are still working with them, it was a good final outcome.
So, Freddy, talking about the same project, the interplay of vibrant corporate colors with a neutral backdrop is very striking. What was the decision-making process behind this balancing of the Bosch brand identity with the need for a very functional and non-distracting work environment?
So I have to say that working with these big brands, big corporations, of course, you always have certain guideline, more or less straight, to follow and to deal with. And in terms of branding, there were a big set of guidelines that we would need to respect. And while we were in the process of designing and soon build the offices, Bosch released their new visual identity, which is something, now if you would look at the project, let's say this kind of rainbowish gradient of color is something that came out during our design process. So we wanted to integrate it. We literally have been creating the first Bosch interior design office that applies this new visual identity. And at the same time, we wanted to do it in a subtle way that would anyway not make the space look, let's say, not as serious enough. I mean, we are working with a German company, so they are, of course, very focused on work and production. At the same time, for them and for us, it was very important to translate this new visual identity into somehow meaningful detail inside their interiors. So we decided to work on mostly neutral colors and materials for all the backdrops, from the ceiling to the carpet floors, to the walls, and so on, and bring the color as a detail on the new elements, as I said before, acoustic elements in the ceiling, or when we pierce the ceiling, the inner skirting of these halls, we apply this rainbowish gradient, as well as picking those colors into customizing the combination of the fabric into the furniture, for example. So this material selection has been a consequence of something that we wanted to integrate, that of course created a very, unique aesthetic output, but this was eventually coming from the will and request of trying to apply this visual identity to them. And again, it has been quite successful. Our attention and details always is somehow focused on problem solving rather than delivering, as I said, something that is just striking or beautiful for its own. And in here, we had to somehow solve this issue of creating this intuitive application of the new visual identity for which there was no reference at all. So I believe somehow through this, we are also telling a bit a story about the brand and make the space meaningful for them in an extra layer, not just the functional and spatial one.
The details seem to play a very crucial role in your design ethos. Can you explain how the attention to detail has shaped the success of, for example, the Somo's office, or influenced your approach towards the problem solving of that project?
All right. Again, here we are talking about another office project, in this case, not a big corporate, but a rather smaller startup that was about to expand. So somehow they knew on one side what they needed and what they wanted based on their current status, but at the same time, they were rapidly expanding. So they were also facing some things that were not necessarily acknowledged by them yet. So we had to really work with them and interpret their workflow and their potential needs to translate them into their new work, into the new working space in a way that could be efficient and flexible. So we applied somehow this idea of boxes inside the boxes, again, trying to maintain the space as open as possible, but at the same time, we needed to differentiate the area where they would meet themselves or meet with the client, larger meeting or single meetings and phone calls. So we had to think about the different scales of operation. So to give visual and acoustic privacy in the different cases where there is one person making a phone call, where there is two people from a creative team discussing with each other, or where there is the larger area dedicated to a larger meeting with the client. So this translated into creating, as I said before, these boxes in the boxes. We created a first sense of entering through a box thanks to this corridor that is created with a metal mesh that is diagonally piercing through the very stiff structure of the office, so it would be very visible, very catchy. And also it leads on one side the customers and the people that are working in there into the open space for the work, and at the same time it creates an area that is used for the meeting, larger meeting areas. And thanks to also some technology like these glasses that can become totally frozen white, we could over time define this sense of privacy. Then in the open space, these smaller meeting rooms are having a space in between them that is open, but somehow totally wrapped into acoustic insulation materials that would allow the people, if they would have to get on a call very quickly or deal with some customer service, being allowed to simply do it quickly without being in the open space where all the other peoples are working. So somehow we try to optimize this workflow efficiency by how we could predict the way of working. So it was very important, again, to listen and understand the client in this case. And this allowed us to imagine and create these layers of functionality for their space.
As the architecture firm, Lapis Bureau strives to have an innovative projects, how do you envision your role in shaping the future of sustainable and human-centered design within urban environments like Shenzhen?
All right, again, a very, very broad question. First, I believe, sustainability nowadays is a word that we hear a lot. Sometimes is misused, or I believe used a bit too much in order to promote or to be in line with certain trends. I believe sustainability is not just about the energetic side of it in terms of resources and so on, but is a much deeper complex. It involves also the culture. It involves also the usage of resources, not just in building the project, but on how this will have an impact in the future. So I believe that, to put it simple, the most sustainable thing that we can do as designers is to make things last, long. The longer they last, the less we have the need of changing the space, changing the function, again, using resources and energy to create something new. So in order to create this meaningfulness into the project, we have to have a deep understanding and predict what can be the proper actions to do for our project, and also predict, giving a certain layer of flexibility, what could happen in the future without compromising the current functionality of the space. So this, of course, is not always easy to achieve, but I believe that in order to be long-lasting, it has to be meaningful, whether it's meaningful for the client, meaningful for the environment, meaningful for the citizens or whoever they use it. So this is, I believe, one of the key aspects of our approach to, let's say, sustainable design in general, is to try to integrate not only the functional part for our client, but try, of course, to use natural materials, daylight, greenery, all elements that, of course, make a more sustainable and beneficial environment, but at the same time, trying to give value, especially when we're working with big corporations and brands like we see before for Bosch, or even in the Somos offices or in the Atlas offices. We somehow given them something that not only works well, but had a little bit of something that makes them iconic, and they feel represented by it. And by feeling represented, I believe it's meaningful for them. And in this sense, somehow, despite, of course, all the materials and energy, as I said before, that you use, if you make something meaningful for them, hopefully it will last long, and maybe they will wait 10 years before changing their offices rather than changing it again after 3-4 years. Hopefully that's how I believe it.
The last question for the day. Looking back at your journey working in the architecture landscape, what personal experiences or lessons or advice do you have to share to the current and admiring professionals and designers all around the world?
Well, definitely, I believe that the future, let's say, of the urban spaces in general is somehow into being inclusive and being adaptive, as I said before, to different functions, to different situations. And I believe it's very important, myself, I'm both a landscape architect and an architect. So in terms of how the space is used by the people, especially in open spaces, I think it's very important. And on one side, I can put it very simple. In the beginning, when I was studying purely architecture, somehow we were working on boxes, and now making these boxes work well and being aesthetically pleasant and so on. Then, of course, with my understanding and study of landscape, then we are also definitely dealing with the space between these boxes. So it's very important that these two things are merged. And I believe that when this is merged in a certain way, it would create a community engagement or social engagement. And especially in a city like Shenzhen that you mentioned, I believe this is working very well. There is a very high level of quality of spaces and so on. And over time, when there is this sense of safety, this sense of social gathering, this is somehow reinforcing the self-belief of human beings, or maybe their mental health, and maybe will incentivize, dialogues and collaborations. Of course, I have to say also there is maybe a layer of technology that, especially nowadays, with AI and with all this fast development of technology, that we could use and integrate in our design that will be beneficial, and it would probably still surprise us. And I'm very happy, almost still like a child, to try to discover and apply new things. I would just mention, for example, while we were working on a project now in Shenzhen, that is the park around the new stadium. Thanks to technology, we were able to somehow generate a public lighting system in our park that is based on the moon cycle and the weather. When there would be the full moon or dark moon, the intensity of the light and maybe the color of the light is changing according to that. So we could test that we could eventually maybe, lower the usage of electricity and energy of almost 20%. This would not have been maybe possible in the same way 10 years ago because the technology was not there. Now it would be very simple to adapt this. So being up to date with the technology, and as architects, think out of the box. Sometimes, there's a lot of existing things that are working perfectly on their own, but maybe no one yet tried to combine them together in a different perspective. And I believe that this is very important. Is what could make the difference between very good design and very efficient design. So hopefully, yes, stay curious, and that would be the best advice that I would.
So, Freddy, that was the last question for the day. Thank you so much for giving your precious time. It was a pleasure to have you here, and don't forget to sign up to the Fublis website. Thank you so much, Freddy.